What began as persistent drizzle over the fields of northern Europe turned, week after week, into relentless downpours. Soil collapsed into mud, seeds suffocated beneath standing water, and entire harvests rotted before they could be gathered. Across vast stretches of farmland, from England to the Low Countries, from France to parts of the Holy Roman Empire, the land that had sustained generations began to fail. For millions, this was not a temporary hardship. It marked the beginning of a slow, grinding catastrophe that would reshape European society through hunger, disease, and quiet desperation. In the early 14th century, Europe was already under strain. The population had grown significantly during the previous centuries, pushing agricultural systems to their limits. Forests had been cleared, marginal lands cultivated, and yields stretched to sustain expanding communities. This growth had brought a fragile balance. Most people lived close to subsistence, dependent on predictable harvests and stable weather. There was little surplus, and even minor disruptions could have serious consequences. Around 1315, that balance began to collapse. A shift in climate, now often associated with the early phases of what historians call the Little Ice Age, brought cooler temperatures and, more critically, excessive rainfall. The growing seasons of 1315 and 1316 were marked by continuous storms. Fields flooded, grain sprouted prematurely in storage, and hay supplies for livestock dwindled. In regions where wheat and rye formed the backbone of daily sustenance, yields dropped sharply. The impact was immediate and widespread. Grain prices rose rapidly as supplies diminished. In many areas, the cost of staple foods doubled or even tripled within months. For wealthier households, this meant hardship. For the poor, who already spent most of their income on food, it meant exclusion from the market entirely. Bread became scarce. What was available was often of poor quality, made from inferior or adulterated grain. Livestock suffered alongside crops. Wet conditions led to disease among animals, while the lack of fodder forced farmers to slaughter herds prematurely. This reduced future agricultural capacity, deepening the crisis. Oxen, essential for plowing, were lost in large numbers. Without them, even when conditions improved, recovery would be slow. Communities began to adapt in desperate ways. People consumed seed grain that would normally be reserved for planting the following season, sacrificing the future for immediate survival. Others turned to foraging, gathering roots, wild plants, and anything that could be made edible. In some regions, records suggest that famine foods such as bark, grasses, and low-quality grains became common components of the diet. Authorities attempted to respond, but their capacity was limited. Medieval governments lacked the administrative structures and logistical networks needed to manage a crisis of this scale. Some rulers imposed price controls or banned the export of grain in an effort to stabilize local supplies. These measures often had limited success and sometimes disrupted trade further. In urban centers, officials tried to regulate markets and prevent hoarding, but enforcement was inconsistent. Religious institutions played a central role during the famine. Churches organized prayers, processions, and acts of charity, interpreting the crisis within a spiritual framework. Many believed the famine to be a form of divine punishment or a test of faith. Monasteries and local parishes distributed what aid they could, though their resources were quickly overwhelmed by the scale of need. As the famine continued into 1316 and beyond, its effects became more severe. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making populations more vulnerable to disease. Epidemics spread more easily among those already weakened by hunger. Mortality rates rose, particularly among children and the elderly. In some areas, death rates are estimated to have reached levels far above normal, though precise figures remain uncertain due to limited records. Social order began to fray under the pressure. Theft increased as people sought food by any means available. Reports from the period describe rising crime, abandoned children, and families breaking apart under strain. In rural areas, peasants sometimes fled their lands in search of sustenance elsewhere, only to encounter similar conditions in neighboring regions. There are also accounts, though often recorded cautiously by chroniclers, of extreme survival behaviors. These descriptions must be approached carefully, as medieval writers sometimes emphasized moral decline during times of crisis. However, they reflect the depth of desperation that characterized the famine years. The famine did not affect all regions equally, but its reach was extensive. Northern Europe was particularly hard hit, with England, Scotland, parts of France, and the Low Countries experiencing severe shortages. In England, contemporary records such as manorial accounts and royal documents provide insight into the scale of disruption. Crop yields fell dramatically, and famine conditions persisted for multiple years. The economic consequences extended beyond agriculture. As food prices rose, wages did not keep pace, reducing purchasing power for laborers. Trade slowed as goods became scarcer and transport more difficult under poor weather conditions. Markets, which relied on regular flows of grain and livestock, became unstable. This contributed to broader economic contraction during the period. Political tensions were also influenced by the famine. Rulers faced increased pressure as their subjects struggled to survive. In some cases, this contributed to unrest or weakened authority. While the famine itself did not directly cause major conflicts, it formed part of a wider context of instability in early 14th century Europe. By 1317, conditions began to improve in some areas as weather patterns shifted and harvests partially recovered. However, the damage had already been done. The loss of livestock, depleted seed reserves, and reduced labor force meant that recovery was slow and uneven. Many communities remained vulnerable for years after the worst of the famine had passed. The long-term effects of the Great European Famine were significant. It exposed the limits of medieval agricultural systems and the risks associated with population pressure and environmental change. The crisis demonstrated how dependent societies were on stable climatic conditions and how quickly those systems could fail. It also left a lasting demographic impact. Although precise numbers are difficult to determine, historians generally agree that a substantial portion of the population perished during the famine years. This reduction in population had complex consequences. In some regions, it eventually led to improved conditions for survivors, as labor became more valuable and resources less strained. However, these changes unfolded gradually and were shaped by many other factors in the decades that followed. The famine also contributed to a broader period of hardship in 14th century Europe. It was followed, within a few decades, by further crises, including outbreaks of disease and continued climatic instability. Together, these events challenged existing social and economic structures, prompting gradual transformations in agriculture, labor relations, and governance. Memory of the famine persisted in chronicles, administrative records, and cultural traditions. Writers of the time documented the suffering they witnessed, often framing it within religious or moral interpretations. These accounts provide valuable insight into how people understood and responded to the crisis, even as they reflect the perspectives and limitations of their authors. Modern historians, drawing on a range of sources including climate data, archaeological evidence, and written records, have sought to reconstruct the famine in greater detail. Their work highlights the interplay between environmental factors and human systems, emphasizing that the disaster was not caused by weather alone, but by the vulnerability of societies operating at the edge of sustainability. The Great European Famine stands as one of the earliest large-scale crises of the late medieval period. It reveals the fragility of food systems, the challenges of governance in times of scarcity, and the human cost of environmental change. While separated by centuries, its underlying dynamics, climate variability, resource pressure, and social vulnerability remain relevant in understanding how societies respond to crisis. In the end, the famine was not a single moment of collapse, but a prolonged ordeal. It unfolded over years, shaped by rain that would not cease, harvests that would not grow, and systems that could not adapt quickly enough. For those who lived through it, the experience was defined not by sudden catastrophe, but by gradual decline, fields that yielded less each season, markets that offered fewer options, and a constant uncertainty about what the next harvest would bring. When the rains finally eased and the land began, slowly, to recover, Europe was changed. The memory of those years remained, carried in records and in the structures of societies that had been tested and, in many cases, reshaped. The famine did not end abruptly, it faded, leaving behind a quieter landscape marked by loss, adaptation, and the enduring need to understand the forces that had brought it about.